I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the 89th episode of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club. We're closing in on that 100. On today's episode, we are going to have 2 interviews with Gilly Macmillan, but first we're going to talk to Rosemary Simpson about her Gilded Age Mysteries series. Rosemary was born in New York City and almost immediately started roaming. By the time she entered college, she had traveled extensively throughout the United States, Far East, and Europe, where she found her second home in France. After returning to the U.S., she earned undergraduate and graduate degrees in French language and literature. She currently lives near Tucson, Arizona.
The book we will be discussing today is Death Brings a Shadow, a Gilded Age Mystery Book number 4. In spring 1889, Prudence and Geoffrey set sail from New York Harbor on a private yacht bound for Bradford Island, where her friend Eleanor Dixon is to be wed. The sea islands along the Georgia coast serve as a winter playground for the likes of the Carnegies, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and Dixons. Despite her Yankee pedigree, Eleanor is marrying a Southern gentleman, Teddy Bennett, and Prudence is thrilled to be the maid of honor. But days before the wedding, the bride is nowhere to be found. A frantic search of the island turns up her drowned corpse in an alligator-infested swamp. Prudence is devastated, but as they prepare the body for burial, she and Geoffrey discover evidence of bruising that indicates Eleanor was held under, most dishonorably murdered. Welcome, Rosemary.
We would like to welcome Rosemary Simpson, who is the author of the Gilded Age Mystery series. Welcome, Rosemary.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
The first 3 Gilded Age Mysteries take place in New York. What inspired you to take Geoffrey and Prudence to the South in Death Brings a Shadow?
That is a wonderful question and one that I've been asked many, many times so far. And the answer really is that if you look at the Gilded Age series, each book has an underlying social aspect in addition to the mystery. In this case, I wanted to investigate Southern culture 25 years after the end of the Civil War. It's also Geoffrey's book in a way, because by investigating the Southern culture after the war, I'm investigating his background, leading towards a larger role in the series for Geoffrey. I had a friend whose father went down to the coastal islands for his health many, many years ago. He kept a diary, which he passed down through the family. And I had some of those entries to guide me in what I was doing.
Geoffrey's unease with his return to the post-Civil War South is clearly felt in this book. Is his character based on a historical person?
Geoffrey isn't based on one person, but he is a combination of many different people. You have to remember that during the era of the Civil War and post-Civil War, many families were split in two. You had cousins in the North, you had cousins in the South. They literally fought one another during the period of the Civil War, had to find a way to come together after the war was over. In Geoffrey's case, had he lived anywhere else, he wouldn't have had conflict that he did. But being the son of a plantation owner and being against slavery, he was, in a sense, even in his own mind, a traitor to his family, a traitor to his region. And this is his great struggle in his character.
Well, that clearly comes through.
Thank you. He is based on a number of people that I knew or whose diaries I read. While I'm not a Southerner myself, I lived in the South for a very long time. I met many people who told these same stories that they had been told by their grandparents, by their great-grandparents, that had passed down through the family. And they always seemed to center around this conflict of who they were, what their ancestors had done, how they could be faithful to their ancestors, and at the same time progress, I guess you'd have to say, as people who were going to overcome past prejudices.
Well, I think that's something that they're still dealing with today.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Well, we were particularly fascinated with the characters of Aunt Jessa and Queen Lula. Was the research into the magical practices difficult to obtain? And were any of the remedies or spells true to life?
The spells and the remedies are all true to life. In fact, I took them directly out of books of spells that were available at that time and that are also preserved in archives and in family chronicles. One of the wonderful things about doing this kind of research is that on the internet, many families have put up pages in which they reproduce family diaries, family letters, so that in reading them, you can actually go back into an ordinary person's everyday life. One of the things was this pervasive sense of superstition, which I think comes from a desire to be able to control your own destiny. So if you didn't know what caused an illness, for example, in an effort to imagine that you have some control over your destiny, you're going to make up ways to either inflict pain or to cure something, and it has to do with superstition. Probably the most familiar one is the making of dolls, and the dolls were made out of corn husks in the countryside. They were blank until it came time to put a spell on someone, and at that point, the face was drawn in, hair was attached, it was often dressed, and it was given a name. People believed that this would inflict pain or disease or even something good on a person. But it was not difficult to find all this information. It's out there, came from the Caribbean, most of it. A lot of it is still practiced today.
Well, what really struck me, and we might not think about this today, but you were talking about how these spells were written down in Queen Lula's spell book.
Yes.
And you don't think about it. She was illiterate to begin with, so she kind of had to work out how to write these words down, and some of them were French Creole. That must have been very difficult. Were some of the books or the resources you found online, were they written in this manner?
Yes, they were. What you have to remember, though, is that although it was illegal in most of the slave-holding states to teach a slave to read, there were significant numbers of individuals who managed to learn to read anyway, especially in New Orleans, because New Orleans has a very different kind of slaveholding history than the rest of the South. It wasn't difficult to find it. They all exist out there.
Well, we're glad you did, because it was a great addition to the books.
Thank you.
When Aunt Jessa declined freedom when the slaves were emancipated, how common was that in the South?
I think the thing that you have to remember is that she wasn't really declining freedom as such. She was free, but she had no place to go. She had no family because they'd been sold off, most of them. She had no money. She had no skills, and she was of a certain age. So the only place she could go was to stay where she was. That actually happened fairly frequently. Former slaves stayed in the area and often became tenant farmers on the same plantations where they had been slaves. It wasn't that uncommon. There was a lot of movement, but you also had families where one family member would stay on the plantation after freedom because they hoped that family members who had been sold off would come back to find them, and that was the only place they knew to go.
How much research did you have to do into the Gilded Age and the role of women who lived in it?
I do a lot of research. One of the things I do is I subscribe to the New York Times and to their archives. And so I usually start my day by reading the archives of the New York Times. So I'm reading Saturday, October 5th, 1890, and I'm reading the obituaries, I'm reading the social news of the day, I'm reading whatever articles happen to appear, and that transports me back in time. It also lends a little bit of verisimilitude, I would have to say, to the style in which the books are written. I can't write in the style of 1890, let's say, because it would be too difficult for a modern reader to slog through. But you pick up little phrases, little ways to construct a sentence. That kind of research helps you create this world. The other thing is the same families often published the diaries and the letters of their parents, their grandparents. In particular, for the first book, which takes place during the snowstorm of March 1888, there exists online a number of letters that people wrote to their family members and diary entries that they made about how horrible that snowstorm was. And all you have to do is find it. It's difficult to search for and find, but then you have it in their actual words. You have their attitudes towards it. As far as women is concerned, there's a tremendous amount of material about women in the categories of law, especially, and family life, what they were allowed to do, what they weren't allowed to do. I think anybody who writes historical fiction, historical mysteries, we love the research. And we always warn each other and ourselves not to go down the rabbit hole of researching, and never getting around to actually writing.
But what a great idea for the archives, just in the fact that I'm sure there's ads in there with the current fashions and the notices that were posted. Very interesting.
Absolutely.
Well, Death Brings a Shadow was a sad story for almost everyone in the book. Was there any historical basis to the people of Bradford Island or Wildacre?
Yes, and that is the coastal islands off Georgia and off South Carolina also. Those are real islands. There are real people still living there today, and they are descendants of the slaves. Those were rice and indigo plantations on those islands. Again, there's a tremendous amount of material on them available on the internet. As I say, since I did live in the South for many, many years, I visited those areas, walked through the live oak forests, scuffed my feet in the sand and in the Atlantic Ocean, and imagined what it was like to live there in an era when there wasn't any electricity, there wasn't any indoor plumbing, there was virtually no communication with the mainland. You had to get in a boat and go across the sound to get to the mainland. So yes, there is a really solid historical base to it.
Part of your education was in France. Do you ever plan on taking Jeffrey and Prudence to visit the City of Lights?
I haven't thought of a valid reason to take them there yet. It's a good thought, but I can't think of a reason to take them there yet. I think what I would have to do is I'd have to zip up the romance considerably, maybe even let them marry. Oh, that would be wonderful. How about a book about their honeymoon in Paris? Would that work?
That would be great. Well, Jeffrey continues to be an enigma. He changes in almost every book to some degree or another. Will Prudence ever really crack that facade he has built up?
I'm not sure. I hope she does. In the fifth book, I just turned this manuscript in on Monday to my editor at Kensington. In the fifth book, I have to tell it without it becoming a spoiler, he undergoes a difficult situation that brings them closer together than ever before. She's on the point of getting through, but I don't think she quite does.
Okay, fair enough.
He is becoming a more complex character than I had originally thought he would be. It's hard to describe exactly how. He's just becoming more real and he has more depth. And with each book, even though Prudence is actually probably the main protagonist, he begins to assert himself in each book.
Well, I really like the dynamic between the two of them. It grows in every new book. It just a little bit closer, but not quite there.
You alluded to the fifth book. Do you have a title, and when is that coming out?
It's coming out in 2020, either late summer or late fall. My books usually come out at the end of November every year, one a year. It is tentatively called Death, Diamonds, and Deception. I'm not sure that title would be the one it actually gets published under. It centers around a murder that has to do with a marvelous necklace that is made out of the Marie Antoinette diamonds that the French government auctioned off and were bought by Tiffany's, then made into marvelous, wonderful jewels.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And that one actually goes more into high society of the time, the Astors and the Vanderbilts. I think it's probably more a Prudence book than it is a Jeffrey book.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to that. Do you have any events or signings you'd like our listeners to know about for the Death Brings a Shadow?
As a matter of fact, I'm going to Pennsylvania in a couple of weeks. I'm going to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, because the county library system chose one of my books as their county-wide read for 2019. So I'm going to make a couple of presentations at their libraries and then I'm going to the Easton Book Festival in Easton, Pennsylvania, appearing on a panel there. And in March, of course, I'll be here in Tucson for the Tucson Festival of Books, which is the 4th largest book festival in the United States. I'm talking to a book club in a couple of weeks. So those are the main highlights.
Okay, can our listeners go to your website to find out about your events?